So it has been an absolutely packed and busy week this week, but we end the week with the fantastic news that Plan B is behind us. And I don't care whether Boris Johnson was forced to do this to save his skin, whether it was a tactic of the most cynical proportions. The main thing is it's gone. And the reason why that's important to all of us, I think, is there's so many important issues in the world. There's so much confronting us in terms of rebuilding society after COVID, that getting rid of the most antisocial measures, the mask wearing for children in schools, the awful rules around working from home that is so atomised society, all of these things, they've gone. Great, I'm really pleased. I therefore would like to celebrate that fact, but let me tell you what's happened inside the Lords. So we started off the week on Monday with the police and crime bill, and it was the big day of the anti-protest amendments which the government had put in. There's a number of things to say about what happened that day in terms of my learning curve. I thought that there'd be loads of speeches where we'd explain why we disagreed with the government. Unbeknownst to me, as the amendments were being discussed, I noticed that the Lib Dems and the Labour Party were making quite short interventions, and I had 3-4 speeches worked out for all the different amendments, and suddenly at one stage the whole amendments group went and I hadn't spoken because it was so fast. I eventually did speak, and then people on our side, as it were, the people who were supporting the right to protest, started telling me to be quiet, and I realised that they had done a tactical decision to not have any speeches, just get to the votes, so that it wouldn't be too late in the night when the votes were happening, because they thought they'd stand a better chance of winning. I object to this, can I just say, very strongly, for 2 reasons. One, they didn't tell me, and you can say that's very egotistical, but they knew I was on their side, but they are so contemptuous that they didn't bother to explain the tactics. So I blunderbusted in making a speech, and they all started guffawing, so I didn't make any dramatic speeches. And secondly, I think that it was just too procedural. I think if you're going to argue against a very big set of government amendments associated with Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, things which the public actually want to be dealt with, you have to explain why. You can't just vote them down. So that really goes against the grain, I think, of a democratic decision. It was, however, very enjoyable that the government were humiliated and that every single one of their amendments on the group of Extinction Rebellion associated amendments was defeated. And I know that because I've been on Talk Radio and GB News explaining this. A lot of people say, oh, have you become a supporter of Insulate Britain? Don't you think that we should do something about it? And to make it clear, when you read the amendments, it was absolutely, totally transparent that these would be used against anybody and everybody. Should there be, for example, protests of people about the high cost of energy? Should, for example, lorry drivers go on a go slow on the motorway? Should you actually want to go on a protest defending a statue of Churchill rather than pulling one down, you would be done under these amendments. So it's very important on principle to fight for the right to protest and not let what you want to happen be used as an excuse to bring in very draconian rules. And it reminds me of when we started on the whole COVID journey. When the Coronavirus Act was brought in, we were told it was absolutely necessary and proportionate to defend people from this awful virus, which we thought was the plague. And anyone who objected to the legislation were considered to be selfish, were irresponsible, didn't care if people died of COVID, granny killer type people. We've learned a lesson from that, I hope, which is that when you actually looked at the legislation, you thought, what has that got to do with anything? And look at the way that they did bring in rules that were entirely unnecessary and over-policed society and were very destructive. And that's what these protest things were like. You can say this is what they're for, as Priti Patel did, and then when you actually read it, you think, oh. So, of course, I'm in a very privileged position. I get to read this stuff. And I knew that it was very dangerous to let it pass. The second thing to say is that a lot of people would understandably, and this is being used by the government, in fact, say, how dare the House of Lords be anti-democratic and argue against it? An argument, by the way, I use myself very often. The House of Lords is unelected. How can it stop government legislation? That would all be true had the government themselves not tried to slip these amendments in through the Lords first. So the amendments we were discussing had never been discussed in the Commons. They weren't mandated by anyone. They were trying to get them passed at the Lords so there'd be less scrutiny, less discussion, and then it backfired on them. So it's important to understand that this was not the Lords rebelling against the Commons. This was the Lords rebelling against a part of the cabinet who had ignored the Commons and were coming straight to us, hoping that they might be able to shame us. What was awkward and horrible was at the end, the government minister actually accused those opposing of their amendments of being middle classes who didn't care about the lives of ordinary people. And sadly, as I was sitting with the Labour benches and the Lib Dems and the Greens, there was some truth in it, because they were delighted that Insulate Britain would now be able to protest away. I tried to make it clear that I was making a general point, and it did feel a bit Brexity, and I thought, oh my God, I feel like I'm on the wrong side. But I can assure you that those amendments would have been used against every working person in this country should they have wanted to dissent on any issue at all. So that's that. So that all happened. The government actually were in a bad way afterwards, because they'd actually hoped that they could retain some of it. So it will all come back at some point and there'll be another fight. But it was an interesting block, and I felt as though, it was a useful thing to have done. One of the things that happened in that was that there was a debate on misogyny, hate crime, which of course sailed through, but not without some of us arguing against it. I was one of them. I decided I wouldn't make it about gender this time, but I've done a lot on that question. I just wanted to talk about the dangers of frightening young women through virtue signalling, saying everybody's a misogynist, and my speech is there on the record for anyone who's interested. But for no apparent reason, out of nowhere, a load of law lords and senior members of the House of Lords decided to stand up and give women in the chamber a lecture about how if you only knew young people, you would know that trans ideology is the new way forward, and that all these women should stop complaining and stop being old-fashioned about establishing biological reality of sex. It was preposterous. I couldn't get over it. And one of them said, I've talked to my daughter and she says this is the norm these days, and everybody in this house is rather old, aren't we? And we don't get out enough, but I can assure you. So there we had very senior lords lecturing us on how we needed to get real, as though somehow the gains of the women's liberation movement were an old-fashioned thing that we were fetishising. I'm telling you that story because it's very interesting how the Lords see themselves. They know they're a set apart, they know that they've got no popular roots, but that somehow used to argue for politics which are entirely destructive, in this instance to argue for identity politics, almost shame people into saying if you don't go along with this, you're not being popular enough, you're not in touch. And that's important because something else has happened this week, quite significant. After the trans women in women's jails debate, I opened my emails and I'd basically got a complaint to the Commissioner of Standards. And of course my heart started beating, and I read it, and it basically said that I'd been accused of misgendering, bullying, so on and so forth, by one person. The Commissioner from Standards actually said, we've decided not to pursue this. And I was so relieved that I sort of got back to say thank you very much for acting so swiftly. Then I talked to the 4 other people who had been involved in that discussion, and they were outraged that we'd even been cleared on a technicality, and therefore more senior people in the Lords who were also accused of transphobia effectively and bullying said this is besmirching our reputation, the idea that we've got off on a technicality, and as a consequence of which we have written back. And then yesterday Lord Cormac made a speech in the House of Lords which was incredibly important, I think, about free speech, and particularly about parliamentary privilege to free speech, and saying if you give up on free speech when you have parliamentary privilege and you're somehow allowed to say a few things because of a technicality we've not found you guilty, it basically is a chilling issue, and one of, I suppose it was one where it was like cancel culture came very close, let's put it that way. And then there was a serious discussion in the in the chamber in which people were actually outraged, even if they didn't agree on the gender critical thing. That was good to see and hear. I had to leave that debate early, so I couldn't speak in it, but apparently people talked about the fact that I was new and outspoken, and something like this would be exactly the kind of thing that would frighten you into silence and submission, and couldn't be allowed to pass. So there are some good traditions in the House of Lords, or parliamentary traditions. The Lords didn't create them, but nonetheless the importance of parliamentary privilege to free speech can't be underestimated either, and it was good to see them not giving in on that, and that fight will come into the public sphere in the future. I was rushing off to discuss the coronavirus regulations, and as a sign of what the anti-democratic nature of what we've been through in the last 22 years, we were all shunted off into some committee room to basically okay regulations that had been gone through in December, but I wanted to use it to make it what I consider to be a very important point moving forward, which is that they won't give in on the mandating of vaccines for health service workers, despite the fact the evidence isn't there. And actually groups like the Royal College of Nursing and all sorts of unions are now saying this is ridiculous and you can't do it. It won't stop transmission, doesn't protect patients, why are you pushing it? But the reason I wanted to talk about it is because I do think that what we've got to get away from post Plan B ending and it moving into the future is to stop seeing each other through COVID eyes. You know, are you vaccinated, are you not? Are you a mask denier or a non-mask denier? I absolutely am enthusiastic about what the medical gains are of vaccination. I am not anti-pharmacological intervention. I'm not anti-big pharma particularly. I mean, sometimes they can be a bit dodgy, but generally speaking, they help. And I hope will help find a cure for cancer, even if they're doing it for profit. I don't care, right? I want that to happen. But what I object to is that those people who are, into health, multivitamins, don't want to take, they should be allowed to say no, right? They don't want to take aspirins, they don't want to gain from cancer treatments, fine, that's their privilege, that's their right. But it's the way that we have a moralistic outlook on this, and I think that the vaccine mandates is still something that challenges us, but that broader way that we view each other suspiciously because of our attitude to COVID, I think has to be removed now. Although it is rather galling to see all these, what can I say, COVID fundamentalists, the kind of zero COVID ice age people, suddenly kind of backtracking. One of the most enjoyable things of the year was the head of the nudge unit denouncing the use of nudge, which has to be ironic gone mad. And actually then saying what we really do is this. It's not really nudge at all, but actually it is. So I think there's a lot of backtracking, but I don't want to crow, even though I just did. We have to now get over that and make social solidarity a very real experience, I think. Otherwise we're in trouble. Finally, in terms of what's coming up next week, I'm going to be arguing in the Nationality and Borders Bill against the state rescinding citizenship, and I'm really pleased that a wide variety of people are going to be putting forward amendments, and I think this is interesting. Lord Moylan from the Tories, I put my name to the amendment. That's the first time I've ever put my name to an amendment, so that's important. And also Baroness Varzi, who goodness knows we probably don't agree on a lot of things, but on that we do agree, and there'll be other supporters of that as well. I think that's very important. It's also the case that next week the health and care bill is going through, and I didn't choose to follow it because I haven't got time, because I'm just one person. But sneakily, Lord Forsyth is a former Tory funder and chairman. I sometimes agree with him on things. He's put forward an amendment in that bill for assisted dying. In other words, he's using the bill to push something. There's already an assisted dying bill going through, put forward by Molly Meacher, but it's not really going to get anywhere, so they're sneakily going through the health and care bill. So although I wasn't going to come down to the House of Lords on Monday and Tuesday, I now have to come because I have to oppose that, because I'm very worried about the misuse of legislation in that way to bring something so important, so ethically charged as assisted dying, just as an amendment, and we have to be very careful about the way that goes. And if I've got a take home of this week, it's that you can have fair weather allies. You know, I said jokingly I was about to join the Lib Dems in one form of thing because I'd agree with them on the police and crime bill, but they didn't even bother to involve me. There's a sectarianism that still exists even when there's cross-party work. But I had this fantastic day on Tuesday. Why do I have a fantastic day on Tuesday? Because I spent all day with people from my former area that I represented as a Brexit Party MEP, the North West, visit me. So I had a kind of trail of people in to see me. I had Trevor and Noah from Bolton for Change. I had John Kelly and Nick Buckley from Reform UK, and Nick Buckley's obviously got a new book out on cancel culture, and I was talking to them. I had Rick Moore, who was Brexit Party but is now involved in the Blackburn Conservative Association. Let me tell you, if anything's going to bring you down to earth and remind you that although the Lords is an impressive historic building, the conversations I had in the tea room with those 5 people were more intellectually and politically stimulating. They made me fight my corner. We had arguments about everything. I thoroughly enjoyed meeting them. Their commitment to local politics, their commitment to not being, of taking back control in a way, of actually making that a real thing, was much more inspiring than anything you'd hear in the chamber. And it was very nice to have the opportunity to let them see the House of Lords, but also not be fazed by it, not be overawed by it, but to hear what is really going on in the Northwest, which is where I'll finish really, which is yesterday a Conservative MP from Bury, one of the Red Wall seats, crossed the House and joined the Labour Party. Everybody thought this was going to be a major occasion. I enjoyed the fact that when the TV cameras went round Bury yesterday, people were going, he's a traitor, who does he think he is? We voted for him as a Conservative. And these were all people, by the way, who previously voted Labour, switched over to vote for the Conservative Party, as they pointed out, because of Leave. A lot of them were saying that on the telly. Trusted Boris on Brexit. They absolutely know that Boris Johnson is not fit to be the Prime Minister, but they want to decide when he goes, not anybody else. And when you vote for a Conservative Party MP, you don't actually think they're about to defect, do you? So they are disenfranchised by that decision. But it's just a great reminder that the electorate, the citizens of this country, are the people who should and really do determine the future of it. And one of the frustrations of the COVID era has been top-down decision-making by experts with no democratic accountability whatsoever. Let's hope that era is ended now. House of Lords will trundle on, but what really matters is what's happening on the streets of the United Kingdom, and that people start restoring their taking back control by organising their lives without government intervention.